Hello, I'm Caleb, part of the Narrate team. This weekend, Adam begins a conversation about the importance of physical health and asks the question that what if your body really does matter?
Top of the morning. How are you? You're kind of wedged in down here. There's lots of room up there this morning. This is like opposite. Did you get your mint? Yeah, I forgot to talk about this last time, so I'm just going to put that right there, and we'll circle back to that so that I don't get accosted afterwards. Like, what about the mint? What was the point of the mint? And there kind of wasn't one. We just thought if we're going to talk about physical health, then we should give people candy, right? Like, this just seemed a logical connection to us. Good morning. We're absolutely thrilled that you're here. If you're a guest with us, it's a privilege that you would check this place out, and if this is home to you, frankly, it's a privilege that you would be here on the last Sunday in June when there's lots of other things that you could be doing. So, welcome. This morning, really, the line of thinking that I'd like to jump into involves, first of all, thinking about the way we think about what causes people to flourish. What's the difference between those who flourish and those who don't, those who thrive and those who don't? And I wonder if as we thought about that, if what we begin to see is the usual suspects are things like money, things like health, things like IQ and ability, and even just life circumstance. But really this morning I want to wonder if that's accurate. And instead ask, well, what if the difference between those who flourish and those who don't, what if it's not money? What if it's not IQ? What if it's not where we end up in life? What if it's not a family of origin? What if it's none of those things? What if it's wisdom? Like, what if what separates those who flourish from those who don't is the ability to make really good decisions and to make them as consistently as possible? I have a friend who is really, really good at connecting with people and helping them sort through their stuff. And we all have stuff. He has stuff. I have it. But he's particularly good at helping other people work through their own. And one of his kind of driving metaphors is to take a bunch of dominoes and to illustrate for people that, because when we get to a place that we find devastating, when we get to a place that we find incredibly discouraging, when we get to a place that we never in a million years thought we'd ever end up, like we thought you only read about this in the paper, we thought this only happened to your friends, that's oftentimes the result of a whole bunch of small decisions. And it feels big and it feels dramatic, and what's really hard to see is a series of small decisions is what get us to here. I remember years ago, when we would lead students and we would take them on these urban mission trips, like one of the more stronger messages we could give when working with an addict, say in a soup kitchen, was to point out, like, listen, it's a series of little tiny decisions that gets you here, not just one giant decision. And what he does with dominoes is he says what happens when we make these little tiny decisions is we make it and nothing happens, and we make it and nothing happens, and we make it and nothing happens. And there's this series of decisions we're making, and it appears that we're making them without any consequence whatsoever. And then eventually what happens is we get 100 dominoes deep, we get 1,000 dominoes deep, we get 50 dominoes deep, and we make the same decision that we've made 100 or 50 or 1,000 times, but this time it tips the whole thing over, and it feels like in a matter of minutes or seconds or days, we've moved from this place where we wanted to be to this place that we find absolutely unbearable, and it feels like it's the result of one thing, but he just uses the dominoes to go, no. It's a string of things. And of course, the question we all have when we get there is, how do we get out of there? Like, how do we reverse that? And the same trend applies, and he just kind of starts picking the dominoes back up and goes, the way you get back over to there is the same way you got to here. It's one decision at a time. And you'll make it, and you'll make the right decision, and nothing will happen. And you'll make it, and it'll be the right decision, and nothing will happen. And you'll make it, and you'll make the right decision, and you'll feel like you're entitled to some kind of change, and there won't be any change. And you do that over and over and over and over again. And sometimes it takes that same decision hundreds of times, thousands of times, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're all going to tip over again, and you're going to have this sense of, like, why do I have it so good? I don't deserve it. And the reality will be, well, it was a whole bunch of decisions strung together that got us to this place. It's why around Narrate, the thing that we've committed ourselves to talking about every Vision Weekend, the first Sunday of September, where we kind of launch a new year together, is just this idea that it's the daily that leads to the dream. So my question is, what if what separates those who thrive from those who don't is their ability to make daily decisions and make good ones? John Ortberg, one of my very favorite authors and thinkers, one of my favorite people to plagiarize, he recently referenced a study that was conducted by some researchers that found that the average person makes 70 conscious decisions a day. Now, of course, a lot of what you do is subconscious, but 70 times a day they say you make a decision. Am I going to check my email? Am I not going to check my email? Like the things that you do just that aren't rote, 70 times a day. which means in the course of a year, that's 25,550 decisions, which means if in 70 years you make some decisions, that's 1,788,500 decisions. What if that's it? Like, what if that's your life? In fact, one philosopher, he said it just like that. He said, go ahead, next slide, can we have that? Life is the sum of all your choices. What if that's true? Like, what if life isn't how much money you have? What if it's not how much IQ you have or how much education or how much opportunity you're given? What if it's your choices? See, in some ways, that this, in my mind, is a perfect way to cap this conversation that we've been in since the 2nd of June, 1st, 1, 8, 15, 22, 29, the 1st of June, called Drift. Because what we've been talking about in this conversation, it's funny. People will come to work for Narrate, and this is a tangent. They'll first start in the culture, and they'll go, so, like, what are the Sundays in, like, April, Adam? And I'll know them, like, 10 months out. And they'll go, how do you know that? And I said, I'll just give it a month. You'll know. This is just, anyway. So, anyway, I now have no idea what we're talking about. What if it is? What if it's just a whole bunch of decisions? See, drift, what we've said is that it's really easy to get from where we are to somewhere we don't want to be. What we've said is that we look at these places and we look at these marriages and we look at these financial situations and we look at these businesses and we look at success and we want it. And what we often fail to realize is you don't drift into success however it is you define it. Like, what you have to do to accomplish the things that really merit being labeled as success, which really are desirable, which really are healthy and enviable, is you have to make a courageous decision. The person who has a successful business made a decision one day that they were going to work really, really hard and sacrifice a lot, and it took courage. The person with a good marriage, nobody has a good marriage just because they married the right person. It takes work. It takes courage. It takes driving a stake in the ground and saying, I've had it. No more drifting. I'm going to decide. And so we've talked about our mental capacities, we've talked about generosity, we've talked about prayer and our families. This morning, I guess I want to cap this whole thing off by saying, if it's true that our life consists of the decisions that we make, and if it's true that the little tiny decisions matter, what role would physical health play in that? Like, what percentage of our good decisions, bad decisions, get categorized as our physical decisions, like our health decisions? And really what I want to explore this morning is what if you've drifted with the way that you think about sleep? What if you've drifted in the way that you think about nutrition? What if you've drifted in the way that you think about physical activity? And what if the result of that drifting is causing you to get results other than the ones you wanted, and you keep memorizing verses and you keep praying prayers and you keep coming to church and the results aren't changing? And some of that is because God says, hey, I made you an integrated person. Here we go. It's not a wrapper. Like, I think, and we'll explore this a little bit more, but I think that we really want Christianity to give us a view of life that says there's this hidden part inside of us. It's invisible. It lives forever. You can't find it when you cut us open. And it's the only part that really matters. And the body, garbage. What if that philosophy is rooted in history, but is absolutely foreign to the thinking of Jesus and the disciples and Paul? What if it's completely unfounded and now I can't eat this? What if our physical choices matter and they matter that much? Have you ever thought about, like, to what degree God cares about your body? Now, let me just say this before we jump in any further. I understand that when you have conversations like this, okay, if you feel like you are the perfect embodiment of physical health, just go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, good. Like, Zach's the closest person I know, and he didn't even raise his hand. So, I mean, I was telling him this morning, I'm very intimidated to talk about health with you standing on the stage. So nobody raised their hand. So my point is this. Could we just suspend shame for 40 minutes? Not even that long. 30 minutes. Not even that long. 27 minutes. Could we just suspend any shame you might feel? My point here isn't to make anybody who's overweight feel bad about themselves, anybody who doesn't sleep enough. That's not the point. But I think, like a lot of difficult topics in life, it's such a loaded topic, it's such a personal topic, that we don't talk about it. And what I've been wondering and trying to figure out how to have this conversation for months, literally, is the cost of that to the church, I think it's bad. I mean, I think we're really good at saying, hey, smoking, but we don't say anything about cheeseburgers, you know? And my point isn't to make anyone feel bad about any of that, nor is it to be extreme on any level, but to have a conversation about the way in which our bodies and the life God calls us to are integrated. Now, let me ask you, have you ever thought about that? To what degree does God care? And some theologians, I listened to a guy named Bill Hybels make a few observations that I thought were profound. He points out that in the Psalms, that the psalmist says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, if you've ever made anything from a house to a business to a relationship, you can understand that that's a detail-specific statement. That God says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. In Genesis 1 and 2, God creates things, and he creates some pretty amazing things like mountains and blue whales and these magnificent creatures, and then he creates people. And yet when he creates the blue whale and when he creates the mountain, he says, this is good. And when he creates people, he says, this is very good. And yet I wonder if we've subscribed ourselves to a thinking, especially if we're quote-unquote churched, that says, well, what he meant there was that Adam and Eve had a soul. Is that accurate? Like, does it at all represent the resurrection life that the New Testament points it to? Could it be that he's speaking about the whole Monty, pun intended, like the whole deal? Like that he looks at Adam and Eve and he says, that's good, very good. Could it be that God's commands on this area are specific? And in fact, did you ever realize, and some people point out, that if ever there was question about the value that God places on the physical body, then we'd have to look no further than the fact that Jesus was born a human. Not a spirit, not like this floaty around creature ghost thing, a human. To which theologians would argue has forever given dignity to the human body. In the Old Testament, after Israel was released from slavery in Egypt, they were wandering around in this wilderness looking for a way to exist, having been told what to do their entire lives, trying to understand what does it look like to follow this Yahweh, this God that we would know as the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament. And God began to give them commands. And yet many would point out that a very high percentage of those commands dealt specifically with the physical body. Things like violence and rape for sure, but also nutrition. Like God had things to say to people about the way they eat. Now, some of them were what we understand were to be like just distinct characteristics. And some were like, no, pigs are gross. They eat anything. Just kidding. I don't mean to be dogmatic there. But some of them, like even modern nutritionalists would go, no, there's some wise observations that God made to these people thousands of years ago about nutrition. Did you know that the idea of a 6-day work week was absolutely foreign to the Egyptians? That in a world where you had to grow and raise what you were going to survive on, the idea that you would spend a day with your feet up watching football? No way. And what God said to these guys, hey, there's this thing called Sabbath, and what I want you to do is once a week, I just want you to rest. I want you to be reminded that you don't provide for you. Ultimately, I provide for you. I want you to be reminded that the world goes on without you. And yet even today, again, we could go read modern medical journals, and what they would affirm to us is no, less is more. The person who works 5 days a week, in many cases, is much more productive than the one who works 7. How much does God care about your body? In 1 Corinthians, which would be a really good place to just live if you really wanted to study this more, but in 1 Corinthians 6, Corinthians, of course, it was a large community, it was a powerful community, and they were a giant thorn in Paul's side as he was trying to help them reconcile what it meant to follow Jesus. And it's fascinating to me that on every issue that came up, whether it was sexuality or idolatry, whether it was the things they eat, no matter what came up, for Paul, the logic behind the right thing to do always seems to come back to the body. In 1 Corinthians 6, he says this, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you've received from God? You're not your own. You're bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your wrappers. Like they matter. And I wonder, especially if you've been sitting in rows like this since you were a kid, if what you've come to associate that with is, but he's talking about your soul. But is he? Like, is that really what we get when we give the scriptures a fresh reading? In fact, as I've spent a lot of time in 1 Corinthians over the last couple months, thanks in large part to a guy named N.T. Wright kind of leading me through that via some work, and I'm already excited for Easter next year because I'm realizing that my understanding of the resurrection is really, really jaded, and I think we have some work to do there. But Paul, time after time after time in 1 Corinthians, affirms to the people, the Corinthians, that Christianity is not a your body doesn't matter movement. See, they were saying, hey, we can have sex with whoever we want, however we want, as often as we want. And Paul was going, no. Like, your body's connected. Like it's all connected. They were saying, yeah, but like food is for pleasure and pleasure for food, like we can, anything we want. And Paul's going, yeah, but it's integrated. It matters. In 1 Corinthians 9, kind of as a culmination of some of these arguments, Paul says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself might be disqualified for the prize. Now, parenthetically, eating disorders are a very real thing and a very giant step away from what God is talking about here. So I realize that in a room this size, some of you struggle with that, and I realize we have to temper this. But here's the question that I think Paul begs us to ask in general. If Paul, we're talking we're talking Michael Jordan. We're talking Bill Gates. We're talking Steve Jobs. Maybe Tom Brady. I'm not so sure. But we're talking like the best of the best of the best, right? Paul's going, if I'm going to accomplish my goals, if I'm going to live out the life, that communion, that baptism, that being a Christ follower, that resurrection, that like that day when I raised my hand, that day when I signed the card, the day when I said, yes, Jesus, I believe in the resurrection, if I'm going to live out that life, then I'm going to have to get in a boxing match with my body. Why? Because it's not just a wrapper. It can actually undo the commitments I make on Sunday morning. Here's my question. If Paul, if he says that, then like, what about me? And what about you? Like, that's Paul. We're just us. See, I wonder, do we underestimate the value of our bodies? I was thinking this week of just when I started to connect the dots of like that my decisions matter. And I think even outside of spirituality, you can begin to get these things. But what's weird is that you build a wall and like you don't consider them on a spiritual level or too much. And then we worship our bodies. And that's part of the crazy tension here. But when I was a senior in high school, I was in a season where I was extraordinarily unhealthy. And my dad was a pretty passive leader. So that's the way the pendulum swings. Like, I'm a control freak. My dad was a pretty passive leader. That's kind of how this goes, right? There's no hope for us parents. I don't have very many memories of him getting pretty firm with me, but I have this one my senior year. I was sitting in the living room. It was Saturday morning. I was in this season of my life where I was just binge drinking every night, and he walked into the room, and he must have said something to engage me in conversation, and I just ticked him off. And he looked at me and he said, Adam, what you're doing every night is a depressant. If you can't handle it, stop doing it. And that was actually instrumental in my starting to kind of go like, oh yeah, maybe this isn't worth it because I wake up in the morning and I hate myself. And maybe there's a scientific connection between what I do on Friday night and the way I feel about myself on Saturday morning. And those dots started to connect. I remember just a couple years later being in college and sitting in a health class and learning that the number one sign of dehydration is irritability. And it was like this moment for me. Like, I've been irritable my entire life. Why did nobody ever tell me this? Like, I've been going to therapy and doing all kinds of things to not be irritable. And suddenly, this water? Like, really? Water? And no one ever told me, like, hey, Adam, when you get up in the morning, drink a couple glasses of water. Because I started thinking, going, well, I swung by the drinking fountain every once in a while. Do you do this? Nobody ever said, hey, Adam, like, after breakfast, make sure between breakfast and lunch you have a couple glasses of water. Hey, Adam, after lunch, make sure you have a couple glasses of water. Hey, Adam, after dinner, before you go to bed, make sure you have a couple glasses of water. And oh, yeah, Adam, when you turn 35, make sure those couple glasses of water before, like, after dinner are, like, before 6 o'clock, or you won't get any sleep. Like, there's all kinds of factors here. But no one ever told me that. I wonder if we've downplayed this connection. One of the things I'm really grateful for as we begin to ask this question of, okay, but what about on a spiritual level? One of the things I'm grateful for is the guys who influenced me when I was 19 and 20 and were pointing me to Jesus and helping me like reconcile that into my everyday life. They were crazy passionate about what they called the quiet time, which it kind of sounds freaky if you've never heard the term, but they were really passionate about the scriptures. They were really passionate about personal devotions. They were really passionate about creating space at the start of your day where you spent time with scripture and allowed space for God to talk to you and you could get to know him and all those things that we talk about around here, and I couldn't agree more with them. And so early in my following of Jesus, that became a habit and a ritual, and frankly, my temperament lended itself to that because I like to read and study and be nerdy, and I like to think. It's the living part that I find challenging, so that was pretty simple for me. But what I remember is I was a terrible prayer. I could learn and I could read, But I'd have these people who would tell me they've been praying for so-and-so for 10 years, and I'd be like, I don't pray for anybody. I remember processing that with a friend, and he said, Adam, just go for a walk. I'm 20 years old. Like, 20-year-olds don't go for walks, right? Like, what are you talking about, go for a walk? It's like the nerdiest thing I've ever heard in my life. I'm going to go for a walk. Like, old people go for walks. I don't go for walks. And he's like, okay, whatever. And he began to explain to me the kinetic piece to the way our minds work. And he said, Adam, I just challenge you. You just go start walking down the street and see if prayer is easier. And those of you that know what I'm talking about, I started and I tried. I remember I lived in my sister's unfinished basement in this neighborhood where there weren't even sidewalks and like nobody walked. So you stood out like a giant idiot if you walked. And I remember walking around this neighborhood and wow, it was a game changer. And then not long after that, Teresa and I were married and we lived about 1.5 miles from MSU Billings, and that was my routine. I started walking, I'd read, and then I'd use the walk time to make my kind of vertical prayer listen connection time. And then I remember I was an intern at a church, and it took me a while to figure this out, but my best leadership time, my best like ideating time, my best preparing for teaching time was when I was walking home from school back home. And now I go like, oh yeah, I get it. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. See, here's my point. I wonder how often we pray and we go, oh, Lord, help me be more patient. Oh, Lord, help me be a better husband. Oh, Lord, help me like treat my kids better. Oh, Lord, help me not be so angry all the time. And I wonder how often God's going, drink some water. Like, just have a glass of water. Like, because we want these spiritual explanations for things, and God goes, no, it's not a wrapper. Like, I gave you a body, and it's integrated and connected. And I wonder, and I don't want to in any way downplay the place of clinical depression, but I do wonder how often we wake up in the morning and we can't get going and we feel terrible, and God goes, well, look at what you ate yesterday. And stop drinking so much beer. Like, what do you think's going to happen? I just wonder if there's these connections. You know, there's these stories, or there's this guy called Elijah. You find his stories in the Old Testament. And he was like multiple MVP award winner in the Old Testament. Like, this guy hit the ball out of the park. There was a season in his life where everybody intentionally walked him, if you know what I mean, if you like sports analogies. Like, he was just an all-star. He was a stud. And there was a season where like seemed like one incredible thing after another happened to Elijah. Like, at one point, he and the prophets of Baal, they got into this tussle, and so they started having this like, who's God's really God kind of thing. You know, you do that with your coworkers, right? And so what he said to them, he said, okay, well, you build an altar and you put some meat on it and you call God to, call fire out of the skies and see how that goes for you. And then I'll do the same thing. And so they get after it, and they're slicing themselves, and they get desperate. Parenthetically, if you have to slice yourself to get God's attention, find a different spirituality. But anyway, so they're doing this thing, and Elijah, frankly, is kind of mocking them. He's this chutzpah. You don't have prophets over for dinner. That's kind of the guy Elijah was. He just kind of laid it out there. And finally, it was his turn, and he just says, okay, Lord, let's do this thing. In fact, I'll dump some water on it and just kind of show that you can do this thing. And boom, the thing starts on fire. God takes the offering. And then in that same season, Elijah gets in a foot race with a chariot. And he wins. So it's like one incredible thing after another. And then all of a sudden, he finds out that Queen Jezebel's mad at him. And the strangest thing, this guy who was like MVP candidate year after year after year, he finds out that Queen Jezebel's mad at him, and he's like, I'm out, I'm done. And some of you remember, he starts whining like, oh, I'm the only one in Israel. I just want to die. And you're going like, what happened to Elijah? Like, where did Elijah go? And do you remember what God does with him? He says, hey, Elijah, come here. See this doggy bed in the corner? Like, I want you to lay on it, and I want you to take a nap. Literally, like God, not literally the doggy bed, but literally, like God gives him a timeout. Hold on, because decisions matter, Elijah, and physical decisions matter, Elijah, and so you're not ready to make this decision, seems to be the implication. You need to get some sleep. And so Elijah goes to bed. And he wakes up, and God's like, here's some food, and it's not a Snickers. Like, here's some, like, good fuel. Now go back to bed. And there's this thing that happens, and you begin to realize that Elijah, if he was dealing with this situation on the front end of all these things that exhausted him and his resources and his emotional energy, he would have been able to handle it. But now he's taxed. And it's not until 40 days later that God goes, okay, now I think you can make a wise decision. You know, in Philippians, one of the greatest promises, I think, is in Philippians. And Paul, he says, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And I guess I wonder how often we find ourselves going, Lord, I need your peace. Lord, I need your peace. Lord, I need your peace. And God's going, yeah, and you need sleep. You need rest. You need to grow in your nutrition. John Ortberg says that when we're physically exhausted, 9 times out of 10 we make the wrong decision, right? Was it General Rommel who said sleeplessness makes cowards out of all of us? See, I just wonder, what if there's a connection? What if that connection's stronger than we think? And what if the answer isn't always more like church stuff? And the answer is God going, hey, I gave you a body, and it's integrated, and if you paid more attention to it, you'd actually get closer to me. Now, there's a guy named Tom Rath, and if you ask this question, like, okay, so how do we kind of gear up and actually begin to think about some of this stuff? There's a guy named Tom Rath, who some of you will be familiar with. He is famous for developing the Strength Finders 2.0 strengths assessment. It's a very good assessment. He works for the Gallup organization, like political season, Gallup polls. That's Tom Rath. He at about 10 years old, was diagnosed with a genetic deficiency where his body's ability to shut down cancerous tumor growth doesn't exist. So he would develop as a kid these giant tumors, and of course, therefore, his prognosis was that he was unlikely to live to be very old, and the result of that was that he became very, very serious, even as a kid, about his health. And he's alive. He's an adult man now. He's an accomplished leader with the Gallup organization, and he recently published a book called Eat, Drink, Sleep, or Eat, Sleep, Move. Is that what it is? Can we have that image? Eat, Move, Sleep. And what it is it's a very quick-hitting read. What he's done here, what's fun about it, those of you that, you need the research, you go to his website, every observation he makes is footnoted back to a medical journal somewhere. I mean, this isn't like, hey, I ate a Snickers every day for 10 days and I felt like garbage, so I stopped doing that. This is researched stuff. And in those 3 categories, he's got bullet point after bullet point after bullet point of observations. Now, we were going to bring the book for you. It's just a little book, but it's a $17 book, and I thought, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. I've got the gift of plagiarism. We'll just put it on worksheets and put it on the heat registers, and you can take the broad notes with you, and if you decide you want to read it, you can. So when we're done, there'll be some bullet-pointed notes over there and over there. He points out, some of you, anybody read Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point? Very famous book here in the last few years where he takes some research conducted. This is going to kind of rabbit trails. Ready? It's not a rabbit trail, but it's kind of convoluted. A professor named Dr. Erickson did some research, and he asked the question, what's the difference between the world's best violinist and the person who teaches violin lessons? And they're both accomplished, but what's the difference between the two of them? And he was really wondering, is it IQ? Is it raw ability? Is it genetic? And this Professor Erickson delved deep into issues like that one and came to the conclusion that the difference is what he calls 10,000 hours. And he observed that the difference between those two people is that it's really hard to get 10,000 hours of anything in. But when people get there, whether they're airline pilots or they're violinists or they're business people, that's the tipping point. Well, Tom Rath points out that that's true. Dr. Erickson's number one observation about what makes the best has to do with 10,000 hours. You know what his second observation, though often not published, was? The next most common attribute between the world-class violinist and the I teach lessons violinist? Sleep. He found that the people who the next most common trait among the best of the best of the best was that they averaged 8.5 hours of sleep a day, which means they didn't have any kids. And the next most common person averaged 7.5. And Americans average 6. And I begin to wonder, if we're going, hey, Lord, could you make me better at my job? And he's going, yeah, I gave you a body. You should try sleeping. It does miracles. There's another bit of research that he quotes in which these scientists took a bunch of mice and they genetically modified them, and so that by 1 year of age, they would be super, super, super old. 100 or something like that in human terms. So sorry if you don't like genetic modification of mice, but we learned some good stuff. So he took these mice, they genetically modified them, and then they took them at 3 months of age, the equivalent of 20 human years. They created 2 groups. The first group absolutely could not exercise. They just made them kind of hang out in their cage and have mice conversations, like Ralph S. Mouse. The other group, starting at 3 months old or 20 years of age, they got to run on a wheel 45 minutes a day, 3 days a week. what they found was that at 9 months, which I believe was 60 years of age, a human equivalent, that the group that just got to sit around and talk about Ralph S. Mouse but not do any of the Ralph S. Mouse stuff, that group at 9 months of age, their hair was falling out. What hair they had was gray. Their muscles were almost completely gone. Their heart was in terrible condition. And here's one that'll scare you, men. And their gonads were quite shrunken. That's what the research said. Their gonads were very, very small. I'm not even sure I know what a gonad is, but it sounds like something I'm familiar with. So the other group, the ones that got to run at 9 months, all their hair, all the color in their hair, their heart was fine, their muscles were fine. Remember, they're genetically modified in order to be breaking down at this point. And their gonads, fine. That's what the research said. Their gonads were in perfect working order. By a year, the first group, every one of them was dead. And then, quotes the research, the second group, it said, none of the second group had died for natural causes. Which I was what does that mean? The researcher stepped on one of them? I'm not sure what exactly that means. See, here's my point. What if you've drifted physically? And what if what you perceive to be a spiritual drift or even a drift in your business and your relationships, what if the common denominator are the physical decisions you're making? What if Paul was onto something when he said there's this unavoidable connection between your body and your soul? What if Paul was onto something when he said you can have these great lofty ambitions and you're going to need your body. You're going to need the cooperation of your physicality. See, we want, and this isn't new, this is as old as Jesus, this is as old as the New Testament, as old as the church. We want a spirituality that says your body doesn't matter. It's going to die and decay anyway. All that matters is your soul. So memorize verses and pray prayers. And what I've realized as I've been studying through 1 Corinthians is you can find that version of philosophy. You can find that version of religion. But it's not New Testament Christianity. The radical nature of Christianity was the resurrection. That the body matters. That life after death has a temporary stage where you're out of body. But what Christ points to, the first fruits of what's to come, Paul says, what he points to in his physical resurrection is what the New Testament claims, that when we believe, what we have ultimately coming is not like chubby people floating around in skies playing the harp. What we have is a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21 and 22, it ends on a planet in a city. And what Paul says is that this body is a seed of that one, which means that there's continuity. We don't entirely understand it, but that God says, no, your body matters. It's connected. I made you a physical person, not just a person stuck in a wrapper. So I wonder, maybe you don't have to feel so shamed about your prayer life. Maybe you just need to go for a walk. Maybe what God's trying to teach you about patience and respect and kindness, maybe it is taking. Maybe you just are dehydrated. Maybe you don't have it as bad as you think. Maybe you're just making these decisions with regard to sugar and other things, and you wake up in the morning and you're exhausted, and those of you in the room who understand the signs of those things are going, anybody would be. It has nothing to do with God and his faithfulness in your heart and soul. It has everything to do with the choices you're making. And we are the sum of our choices. And if you're someone here and you're trying to still explore, who is this Jesus and what does this mean? The thing that my passion is growing for, it was a bad sentence, but never mind. It's the reality that the New Testament was a resurrection movement. It wasn't rooted on ideas. It wasn't rooted on philosophy. It was rooted on a day. And the thinking was, that doesn't happen, just like it is today. And the belief was, wow, if that happened, then God was in him. God was with him. And what the New Testament is constantly helping us reconcile, just like the song Zach and the band led us through. Christ is risen from the dead. We are one with him again. And the power of that's the Christian life, working in concert with God. Let me pray for you as you just kind of try to land some of this in your heart. And God, Lord, I'm thinking specifically of those of us who have these much more permanent physical struggles, and that you would give us wisdom in terms of how we work all this out. And also, Lord, that that you just give us wisdom, because we know that it's to such a big degree comprises our life. God, would you give us wisdom as we think about sleep? Would you give us wisdom as we think about exercise and movement? Would you give us wisdom as we think about nutrition? Would you help us find that healthy balance between a worship of our bodies and an honest appreciation for the fact that you gave them to us? And that there's an integrated nature between the way we experience you and the way we serve and treat others and the way we interact with our own bodies. We love you, Lord. Amen. So just a couple things before you take off. First of all, so there are these bulleted kind of notes pages on each of the heat registers if you want to grab one of those. I even thought if you grabbed something from one of the 3 categories and worked on it, that could be fun. And then there's flyers for Activate, which is that kids camp, kids experience, on the Guest Central table. And if you came with your 7 golden stars on your That-a-Boy prayer card, yeah, well done, Ron. So if you brought that, you can take that back to Guest Central too, and they'll help you trade that for a beverage from one of your 2 favorite places. And there's those. I think that's everything. Oh yeah, I was going to say this. So next week, my friend David Casey will be here. Many of you know him as one of the more respected musical artists in our community. He and I, we run together on Mondays, and we have these long, nerdy conversations about the tension between creativity and the tension between spontaneity and being planned. And you would guess which one I air to, and he airs to the other one. And so we've had these really fun conversations, and that's what he's going to wrestle with here is, as an artist and as a Christ follower, how do we balance the reality of those 2 needs? And then on July 13th, I'm going to back up the dump truck of my anxiety learnings. I've been working on this for the last year or so at a really heightened level and felt like it'd be a good challenge to me to commit to going like, hey guys, here's what I've learned, and I think it might be helpful for you. And then on July 20th, we're going to start a series called What the What?, which we're very excited about. Even going to answer questions like, why does a church do an Ales festival? So kind of a real central 1.0, who are we and how does it matter and how do we all fit into this together? So I know we're supposed to lay down and die in July, but we're not gonna. We're excited for July as anything. So love you guys. Have a great 4th too.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.